Hello, my name is Jackie. Welcome back to my YouTube channel, and today I have the start of a very exciting video. So, if you watch my videos, you know that I enjoy reading Agatha Christie. I am on a mission to read every single book that she ever wrote. And in the past several months, a lot of people have been making videos on YouTube in which they try to solve Agatha Christie mysteries. A lot of people have jumped on the bandwagon, and since I love watching these videos so much, I thought, why not make one myself? So the mystery that I am going to try to solve is Murder at the Vicarage, which is the first of the Miss Marple mysteries. This series is set in the fictional small town of St. Mary Mead, and our sleuth is Miss Marple, a local spinster and busybody who uses her ways of knowing things to solve crimes. I started reading this book last night and I thought to myself, you know, making a video where I try to solve this book could be really fun. So I have my post-it notes with all the suspects, and there are a lot of suspects. I will give you a closer look so you can see, and I'm gonna try to figure out who done it. This first book takes place in St. Mary Mead, and it follows the murder of Colonel Prothero, the local magistrate who is hated by pretty much everyone in town. So when he turns up dead at the vicarage, there are no shortage of suspects. So first, we're going to go through the characters of this book. I feel like for an Agatha Christie, there are a lot of characters here, so hopefully you will be able to follow along. I did read the scene where Colonel Prothero's body is discovered last night. However, I'm going to read it again just to make sure I didn't miss anything. I will obviously be spoiling the outcome of this book in this video, so there will be spoilers. If you haven't read this book yet and you don't want to know who the murderer is, do not watch this video. I will be giving away lots of plot details, though right before the final resolution I will give another spoiler warning in case you decide you want to check out at that point. Maybe you read this book already. Maybe you just don't care if you get spoiled or not. If so, let's go along on this journey together. First off, our narrator of this story is the local vicar. His name is Mr. Clement. His nephew calls him Uncle Len, so I'm assuming his first name is Len or Leonard. Mr. Clement's wife is named Griselda Clement. Now, she is significantly younger than her husband. Her and her husband actually got engaged after only one day of knowing each other. Also seeming to live with them is Mr. Clement's nephew, Dennis, who is 16 years old, and they have a serving girl living with them named Mary, who is not very good at being a serving girl. She is not a very good cook, and I don't know if Agatha Christie is just trying to play this for laughs, or if that is actually relevant. Another character mentioned in connection with the vicarage is Mr. Hawes. He is the curate, and he has only been at the vicarage for 3 weeks. So, like I mentioned, our murder victim is Colonel Prothero. Now, Colonel Prothero is the local magistrate, and he lives at this estate called Old Hall. Very creative name, yes, I know. And pretty much everyone in town hates Colonel Prothero. It is also mentioned, and I think this could be significant later, that his first wife left him for another man before he moved into Old Hall. And I feel like that is going to be somewhat relevant because otherwise, why mention it? So let's put a pin in that. So, Colonel Prothero also has a daughter from his first marriage named Lettice. I'm not sure exactly how old she is. I don't know if they mentioned it, but she is a young woman, and his second wife is named Anne. Now, Lettice does not like her stepmother Anne that much. I don't know exactly why. Maybe just because she has a stepmother that's not that far apart in age from her and there's conflict there. So, speaking of conflict, there is a local artist named Lawrence Redding. I said he's a local artist. He's not local, but he is currently staying in the art studio attached to the Vicarage, and he is working on a painting of Lettice Prothero, as well as a painting of Griselda Clement. And there has been some conflict in the Prothero family because Lettice wants Redding to paint her in her bathing suit, and Colonel Prothero thinks that's showing a little bit too much skin. So Redding has been told not to come to Old Hall again, though Lettice intends to still sneak around and have the portrait done. There are rumors in the town that Lettice and Redding might be seeing each other, but we're going to get back to that in a couple minutes. So other characters connected to the Protheros are Dr. Stone, and he is a famous archaeologist who is in town to do some work at Old Hall. He brought with him his 25-year-old secretary or assistant, I forget exactly which, and her name is Gladys Cram. Like I said, she is 25 years old, unmarried. Dr. Stone is unmarried, so the local busybodies are convinced that Miss Cram is trying to seduce Dr. Stone and get him to marry her. I think it could be potentially significant that they are having archaeological work done at Old Hall, because what does an archaeologist do? They dig things up, and I wonder if perhaps Dr. Stone at some point during this book is going to discover something that maybe Colonel Prothero didn't want people to find. My first thought was, what if they find the first Mrs. Prothero's body? That was my first thought. However, she left him before he moved to Old Hall, and also, based off what's been said so far, it sounds like Mrs. Prothero is still alive, the first Mrs. Prothero. So that's probably unlikely, but I still wonder if perhaps this archaeological project is going to turn up something unexpected. All right. We're not done yet. There are a lot of other people in this village. I hope that you are following along so far. So, another new resident of St. Mary Mead is Mrs. Lestrange. She is now inhabiting this estate called Little Gate, I think it's called, something Gate. And she's new in town. They don't know a lot about her, and she very rarely leaves her estate. However, it appears that she might know the local doctor, Dr. Haydock, because Dr. Haydock has visited Mrs. Lestrange at her home, so people think there might be a connection between the two of them. Mrs. Lestrange does show up at church after the Wednesday evening service, and Mr. Clement, the vicar and narrator, talks with her for a little bit. He does not find out anything about her past. He doesn't ask, and to him, she seems like a very nice woman, but a little bit mysterious. He's not exactly sure what's up with her. Then finally, we are introduced to St. Mary Mead's resident busybodies, one of whom is Miss Marple, our main sleuth of this series. I did not put her on the door because obviously Miss Marple is not going to be the killer. She is the protagonist of this series, so obviously it's not going to be her. She is clearly not the killer. I did put up the character of Mrs. Price Ridley because she is the one we know the most about so far. There are two other female characters who are introduced. However, at this point, I'm not sure how relevant they're going to be to the story, and I really don't know anything about them. So if they end up becoming a bigger part of the story later on, I will put them on the door as well. But I wanted to include the character of Mrs. Price Ridley because we do learn a couple things about Mrs. Price Ridley. Apparently her son is deceased. It does not specify how her son died or what happened to him, but I thought that is worth mentioning. Another thing about Mrs. Price Ridley is she believes that someone may have taken money from the collection plate at church. And the vicar doesn't seem to believe this, but Mrs. Price Ridley is adamant. She claims, I put a £1 note in and I don't know what happened to it. So she did tell Colonel Prothero about someone potentially stealing money from the collection plate, the money potentially going missing. So right now her claim is not taken seriously, but again, it's a detail that I wanted to mention because who knows, it could be relevant later. I just threw a lot at you. We meet a lot of characters at the beginning of this book. I just picked out what I personally thought might be relevant later on in the book, and I will update you on further developments. Actually, I realized I already forgot one thing, and it's a biggie. Okay. All right, so remember how I said people think that Lawrence Reading, the painter, is potentially in love with Lettice Prothero, Colonel Prothero's daughter. That is not the case because while he is walking home, the vicar sees Lawrence Reading kissing Anne Prothero. So he is not having an affair with the daughter, he is having an affair with the wife. And the vicar basically tells Mr. Reading, you know, nothing good could come of this. You need to leave town. And Lawrence Reading says, yes, vicar, you know, you're right. She is a married woman and I will leave town tomorrow. However, I want to have this evening to say goodbye first. So, first major piece of intel, there is a secret affair going on between Anne Prothero and Lawrence Reading, the artist. Now I think you're up to speed. I am going to reread the scene where Colonel Prothero's body is discovered, and then I will give you a play-by-play description of that. Another thing I wanted to show you is that this book does have a picture illustrating the vicarage, which is next door to Miss Marple's home, and I thought I would show that to you. You can pause if you want to get a better look. That is the layout of the vicarage, and it is mentioned that people often come into the vicarage through the window in the vicar's study because that is by the lane that many people walk along. So people often come through the window in the study. All right, developments. I got back up to where I read last night and I took notes so I don't miss a single detail. So, one thing that I forgot to mention earlier is after having dinner with Lawrence Reading, the artist, Dennis, the nephew, seems bothered by something, but we don't know what it is that was bothering him. But he was acting a bit suspicious. So, the night of the murder, Colonel Prothero is supposed to meet the vicar in the vicar's study at 6:15 p.m. However, the vicar receives a call telling him to go to one of the local farms where a man is dying. So, he tells Mary, tell Colonel Prothero I will see him around 6:30 or soon after that. I have to go take care of this. That same day, Griselda, the wife, has gone up to London, so she is not home, and Dennis is also not home either. He's supposed to be out with some friends. So, it is closer to 7 o'clock when the vicar finally makes it back to the house. It is 6:45, And as he's walking up to the house, he sees Lawrence Redding leaving, and he is hysterical. The vicar says, "I have come to see Colonel Prothero. He's waiting for me in the study." And Lawrence Redding, he is a mess. He starts saying, "Oh, Colonel Prothero, you'll see him all right." And then he rushes off. When the vicar goes into the house and into the study, he finds Colonel Prothero dead, slumped over the writing desk. He's been shot in the head. However, they do not find the gun at the scene. Now, here's another thing. We find out that when the vicar showed up at the farm, the supposedly dying man was actually on the up and up. His family did not expect to see the vicar at all, so it seems they weren't the ones who actually phoned him. It seems that someone wanted to get the vicar away from the house. The murderer, perhaps. So, Colonel Prothero is dead at the writing desk. Dr. Haydock is summoned, and he says that Colonel Prothero has been dead for about half an hour. So he died 30 minutes ago, give or take 5 to 10 minutes. But he's adamant it has to be in that window because the blood is beginning to congeal and he is cold to the touch. So, the clock on the writing desk is smashed and stopped at 6:22. However, the clock is actually 15 minutes fast. So, that does not make any sense at all for the time of death, because that would have been just after 6 o'clock, at which point Colonel Prothero wasn't even at the house yet. Now, like I said, Colonel Prothero is dead at the writing desk, and it appears that when he was shot, he was in the middle of writing a letter to the vicar, basically telling him, "Hey, sorry, I can't wait any longer for you, I have to leave." And at the top of the letter is written 6:20. However, that again raises questions, because the vicar and the colonel were originally supposed to meet at 6:15. Would Colonel Prothero really take off just because the vicar is 5 minutes late? And Mary was supposed to tell him that the vicar was going to be late anyway. So, if this was really written at 6:20, why does Colonel Prothero need to take off so soon? It doesn't make sense. Things get interesting. Lawrence Redding goes to the police station, throws his pistol down, and says, "I did it. I killed Colonel Prothero." However, Anne Prothero, who, as you know, is having an affair with Lawrence Redding, claims that she actually killed her husband and Lawrence Redding is covering for her. However, it seems like they are both lying to protect the other, because both of their stories just do not make sense with the facts. However, it was Lawrence Redding's pistol that was used to commit the murder. When Lawrence Redding showed up at the house and he saw the colonel's dead body, he panicked, picked up the gun, took it with him, thinking that Anne had used it to kill her husband, and that was when he ran into the vicar outside the vicarage. Now, this pistol apparently was just laying around in the art studio, not locked away or anything, so anyone who showed up at the art studio could have taken the gun. Now, that is not proper gun safety, kids, okay? If you have a pistol, do not leave it lying around. Someone may steal it and use it to murder your lover's husband. So don't do that. Now, we have a conversation with Miss Marple, whose house is right by the vicar's house. And she says that the night of the murder, from 5 o'clock on, she was outside working in her garden. And at 6:15, she saw Anne Prothero, who definitely did not have a pistol with her. She did not have a handbag, and there was no way she could have hid it in her clothing. Then they talked for a few minutes, and Anne said that she was going to meet up with her husband and they were going to walk home together. However, almost immediately after she headed for the study, she doubled back and went into the art studio. And 5 or 10 minutes afterwards, so somewhere in the range of 6:20, 6:25, Miss Marple heard a gunshot, a single gunshot, coming from the direction of the woods. Now, the book does have some more maps of both the vicar's study and of St. Mary Mead, where everyone's houses are, so I will show you that so you know where the woods are located. Now later, the vicar does ask Mary, the servant girl, about this, and when he asks her if she heard a shot coming from the woods, she says, yeah, now that you mentioned it, I did hear that. It was a single gunshot, and she says it was about 10 to 15 minutes before Redding came by and discovered the colonel dead. Other things that Miss Marple saw that night. So, Mr. Redding came from the direction of the village, and at 6:30, he and Anne Prothero left the art studio together and started walking along the lane. When they reached the end of the lane, a woman who looked like Miss Cram joined them. Now, Miss Marple thinks it was Miss Cram. However, she cannot be 100% certain because she didn't have her glasses on, but she thinks it was Miss Cram because the woman was wearing a short skirt. So, we think that was Miss Cram, however, we cannot be entirely sure. I'm not sure what other characters would be wearing a very short skirt. Perhaps Lettice, but supposedly she was out playing tennis this evening. I think it's just important to mention that she's not 100% sure it was Miss Cram. Maybe later in the book we'll find out it was actually someone else instead. And you know what really grinds my gears is Miss Cram, the day after the murder, comes by the vicarage to talk to Griselda. And the vicar does not ask her if that was her who walked with Lawrence Redding and Anne Prothero the night before. If it were me, I would have asked her if that was really her who joined them at the lane, but he did not ask. One piece of information that Miss Cram does reveal is that that morning, Dr. Stone, her employer, is supposedly sick. She says it is nothing serious, but let's just, note that because that could be suspicious. Why is Dr. Stone indisposed the morning after the murder? Lettice Prothero comes by and she claims that she left her yellow beret in the vicar's study. However, she can't go into the study to get it because the inspector has locked the study and no one can get in. Miss Marple seems to imply that Lettice may have ulterior motives for coming under the guise of looking for her beret. So potentially she had another motivation. Maybe she wanted to go into the study to look at something else. Not really sure. We also learn that Mary, the serving girl, she was having a relationship with this man named Archer. And Archer was recently sent to jail for poaching by, you guessed it, Colonel Prothero. So potentially that gives Mary a motive for killing Colonel Prothero because he sent the man that she loves to jail. Dennis, the nephew, is very gung-ho about trying to solve this crime, and he claims there is a footprint in the flower bed outside the study window. The detectives really dismiss this. They say it's not important. It was probably just the gardener, but maybe it wasn't actually just the gardener. Maybe it was left by the killer. We have Colonel Melchett is one of the investigators. He is the chief constable for St. Mary Mead, and we also have another character named Inspector Slack. He is from the police department in a nearby town. And one of the things we learn about Inspector Slack is that he thinks he is very smart, but he's not really as intelligent as he seems to think he is. The vicar tries to tell him multiple times that the clock in the study is 15 minutes fast, and Inspector Slack will not let him get a word in edgewise. I haven't made sticky notes for them because as the police characters, I think they're probably not the killer, but we'll have to see. Anything's possible. Right now, I don't have a strong theory, but if at this point in time I had to guess who the murderer is, I would say I am very suspicious of Dr. Haydock. So we find out that the morning after the murder, he is in very good spirits. He seems very happy, which is odd considering someone was just murdered. Now, the exact time frame of when Colonel Prothero died, we only have his word for it. So I wonder, is the timeline really reliable? Because I don't know that I fully trust Dr. Haydock at this point in time. I'm gonna throw out another crazy theory, and I could be way off because I don't have much to support this theory. It's just a thought that I had just now. So, we also find out that Mrs. Lestrange went to Old Hall the day of the murder. She showed up while the family was having dinner, and she went to the morning room to wait for Colonel Prothero, and after dinner, Colonel Prothero went to the morning room to speak to her. Why did she go to speak to Colonel Prothero? Now, another thing we know about Mrs. Lestrange is her and Dr. Haydock seem to have some sort of connection because he is repeatedly going to her house to speak with her, and Mrs. Lestrange does not leave her house that often. She sometimes walks around the garden, and she went to the church, but she went on the night of Wednesday night service when there were very few people there, and it seems like she didn't interact with anyone except the vicar. So, here is my crazy, off-the-wall theory, all right? What if Mrs. Lestrange is actually the first Mrs. Prothero? So we know that the first Mrs. Prothero left Colonel Prothero before he moved to Old Hall, and it seems like she left him for another man. Maybe Dr. Haydock? Question mark? But I was just thinking, if she really is Colonel Prothero's first wife, that could explain why she went to visit him and also why she doesn't want to socialize that much in the town. Maybe there's a reason she wants to keep a low profile because she thinks some people might recognize her if they saw her. I don't know. This is just something that popped into my head this evening while I was in between clips. So I could be totally wrong, but you know, I'm just here to theorize. Usually when I read a mystery, I just throw a bunch of shit at the wall to see what sticks. So this is my first theory. I could be wrong, and also, if she really is the first Mrs. Prothero, I don't know why she's come back or what she wants from Colonel Prothero, and why her and or Dr. Haydock would want him dead. I'm just saying I'm really suspicious of Dr. Haydock right now, and I think that could explain some of Mrs. Lestrange's strange behavior, no pun intended. I also am kind of suspicious of Dennis and Mary, but if I had to guess somebody as the killer right now, I would probably say Dr. Haydock, who is in league with Mrs. Lestrange. That's just my theory right now, though, and I will update you in a couple chapters. This has actually been really fun so far. I love trying to play detective like this. It's definitely causing me to read slower than I usually would because I'm trying to make sure I don't miss anything, but this is really fun. I really am enjoying this video so far. Okay, I actually had one last thought while I was in the shower that I wanted to say before I wrap it up for the night. So the vicar actually mentions that Mrs. Lestrange, her hair on her head is an entirely different color from her eyebrows. I believe he says that she has like reddish gold hair, but dark eyebrows. And I don't know about you, but I have never met someone with totally different hair and eyebrow colors like that where it wasn't a dye job. So perhaps Mrs. Lestrange is dyeing her hair because she's actually the first Mrs. Prothero. Dun dun dun! I don't know. I just thought, I had that thought. so I thought I would share it. Good night. Talk to you tomorrow, hopefully. This is going to be a quick update. I might be able to update again later. I don't know. I have a bit of a busy evening ahead. However, I had 2 quick thoughts that I wanted to share. First, one of the things I flagged about Mrs. Price Ridley is the reference to her having a deceased son, and it didn't reference his manner of death, which I thought could potentially be relevant. However, upon further reflection, here's what I'm thinking. I think this probably was a throwaway comment, and this book was written after World War I, before World War II, and so I'm assuming her son probably was killed in World War I. And I think probably a contemporary reader reading this book when it was published would have assumed that, whereas I, not living in a time where the war just happened, was automatically wondering if there was something suspicious there. So I actually think that's not relevant, but you know, the thing about the collection plate, maybe that'll be relevant, maybe not, I don't know. I also wanted to talk about Dennis. So I mentioned that after having dinner with Lawrence Reading, the artist, Dennis was in a weird mood and he seemed upset. He told the vicar he wanted to talk about something, but they were interrupted, which is suspicious. However, I was originally thinking maybe that means Dennis is the murderer. He's involved somehow, or he knows something. I now have an alternate theory. I think that the reason Dennis was in a bad mood after seeing Lawrence Reading is because Dennis has a crush on Lettice Prothero. Now, we know that the two of them seem to be on friendly terms based on what's happened in the book so far, and there is a rumor going around town that Lawrence Reading is seeing Lettice, which obviously we know is not true, but Dennis doesn't know that. So I wonder if he was upset because he sees Lawrence Reading as a potential love rival. I think this makes a lot of sense, and I know from my previous experience reading Agatha Christie that she loves to have a romantic subplot with 2 characters announcing their love for each other at the end. So maybe that's the case with Dennis and Lettice. I don't know, but I am not as suspicious of Dennis as I used to be after that. If I had to guess at this moment, I think I would still go with Dr. Haydock and or Mrs. Lestrange. I really think she could be Colonel Prothero's first wife, but I could be wrong. So that's what I'm thinking at this moment. I'm going to write the clues or potential clues we have so far on some sticky notes and put them on the door as well. I will show you that later, and I will hopefully be able to read some more tonight and provide another update soon. Let's talk about Dr. Stone and his secretary, Miss Cram. Now, Dr. Stone is the archaeologist who's working on the Prothero estate. Miss Marple tells Mr. Clement, the vicar and our narrator, that she woke up around midnight, and when she looked out the window, she saw Miss Cram walking in the direction of the woods with a suitcase, and moments later, she returned from the woods sans suitcase. So Saturday, after the inquest into Colonel Prothero's death, Dr. Stone says that he is going to London. He's gonna see his mother and handle some business with his lawyers. He'll be back on Tuesday. The vicar walks with Dr. Stone to the train station where he narrowly catches his train. Now, Miss Marple's nephew, Raymond, is coming to visit her. I don't think he's going to be a very important character in this book, but he is relevant to this next thing I'm going to tell you. And so Raymond sees the vicar with Dr. Stone at the train station. Then later, after Dr. Stone leaves town for London, the vicar and Griselda are having dinner with Miss Marple and Raymond, and they start talking about Dr. Stone, who Raymond met at a dinner or a party or something a few months ago. And you know what Raymond says to the vicar? He says, "But that man that you were with at the train station, that wasn't Dr. Stone." Bombshell! He's an imposter! He's not the real Dr. Stone! So they find the suitcase in the woods, and the vicar also finds nearby it a small brownish crystal. What's inside the suitcase? It's a change of clothes for Dr. Stone, as well as several items stolen from Colonel Prothero's house. So it seems like the two of them were secretly stealing from Colonel Prothero, and Dr. Stone was planning to escape from St. Mary Mead before he could be caught. He was going to come back to town to get the artifacts, change his appearance, and then they were both going to make a quick getaway out of there. So it seems like Dr. Stone, not his real name, and Miss Cram are not murderers, but they are liars and thieves. Speaking of liars, somebody else was caught in a lie. Now, remember we mentioned that the day of the murder, Griselda, the vicar's wife, was in London, and she came back to St. Mary Mead by the 6:50 train. Well, while the vicar is at the train station taking Dr. Stone to the train, he runs into an acquaintance, and the acquaintance says, "Oh, can you believe how late the trains are? They're never on time. You know, just the other night, the 6:50 train from London was half an hour late." That means Griselda was not really on the 6:50 train, because then she should have been home half an hour later than she actually was. Now, somebody also sends the vicar an anonymous letter claiming that Griselda is carrying on an affair with the artist Lawrence Redding. And the vicar, basically, he talks to Griselda about this, and she says, "Yes, I was not completely honest with you. I actually knew Lawrence Redding many years ago, and I used to be in love with him. I didn't tell you about our history because I didn't want you to get the wrong idea." So, listen, I don't know if Griselda is the murderer or not, but she has been caught in a couple lies. Okay, more updates. We have a little bit to say about our friend, Mr. Hawes, the curate, who we really have heard very little from since his original introduction. So it turns out that Dr. Haydock has been treating Hawes for this condition called encephalitis lethargica, and there was an epidemic of this from 1917 to 1926. Now, I think my Mrs. Lestrange being Colonel Prothero's first wife theory and being behind the murder in league with Dr. Haydock is looking more and more likely. However, with all the signs pointing in that direction, I'm starting to doubt myself. I'm wondering, do I just have blinders on? Is there something I'm not seeing? Is it too easy? I mean, it still makes perfect sense to me, but the fact that it makes perfect sense is causing me to wonder, like, if I'm missing something. Is it too obvious? I don't know. So, as we discussed earlier, it is now confirmed that the killer was the one who wrote 620 on that note found with Colonel Prothero's body. We already suspected that. It really wouldn't make sense that he would be ready to leave at 620. And later on, Anne Prothero makes a comment that she's not convinced any of the note looks like it was in her husband's handwriting. So is it possible he didn't write any of it? So we find out that Mary heard that gunshot from the woods at just past 6:30, like around 6:35-ish. And this lines up with something that Mrs. Price Ridley says. So Mrs. Price Ridley goes to the police station to complain about obscene language. Yes, Mrs. Price Ridley is the original Karen, confirmed. So this obscene language came in the form of a threatening phone call she received the night of the murder, and this very strange voice was basically threatening her, sort of alluding that Mrs. Price Ridley knows something and she needs to keep her mouth shut. She describes the voice as perverted, both gruff and squeaky, and she doesn't specify whether it was a male or female voice. However, just around the time of this phone call, or shortly after, is when Mrs. Price Ridley also heard a shot in the direction of the woods, and this lines up with the time that Mary heard the shot. So at this point, I'm thinking Colonel Prothero was probably killed around 6:35 p.m. Once again, Dr. Haydock is acting suspicious. So when he hears that Redding and Anne are no longer suspects in Colonel Prothero's killing, he seems a little dismayed and not too happy about this news. Anne later observes to the vicar that she thinks Dr. Haydock looks sad. So clearly there's some stuff going on with Dr. Haydock's moods. But we also had a line where Anne and the vicar both agreed that Dr. Haydock is one of the best guys they know, so for what that's worth, maybe Agatha Christie is trying to sell that he's a great guy, and he actually is going to be the killer? I don't know. Now, Mrs. Lestrange also sends the vicar a note asking him to come over to her house because she wants to talk to him about, quote, a great trouble. However, she is never able to tell him what that trouble is because Inspector Slack shows up and interrupts them. And when the vicar leaves the house, she basically says, you know what, I've decided I don't need to confide in you about this at all. And she makes a comment basically saying, I've already decided my part. Which is a strange thing to say. So when asked by Inspector Slack what she was doing the night of the murder, she says that between the hours of 6 and 7, she was at home and her maid was not home because her maid had the day off. I believe earlier I mistakenly said that Mrs. Lestrange visited Colonel Prothero the day of the murder. It was actually the day before. Just want to make that clear. Inspector Slack doesn't entirely believe her because one of the neighbors apparently showed up at Mrs. Lestrange's house after 6 p.m. but before 7, and though she knocked repeatedly, nobody answered. So if Mrs. Lestrange was at home, why didn't she answer the door? She claims it was just because she didn't want to talk to this person, but it does cast a bit of doubt on her story. Another thing, so the day before the murder when Mrs. Lestrange visited Colonel Prothero, she visited him while the family was sitting down to dinner. And Inspector Slack asks her why she did this because it's a weird time to pay a social call on someone. Mrs. Lestrange says the reason she did that is because she only wanted to speak with Colonel Prothero, not with Anne or Lettice. The police decide they are going to trace the call that the vicar received luring him away from the house the night of the murder, as well as the threatening call that Mrs. Price Ridley received. Now, where do you think these calls originated from? Whoever called the vicar called him from one of the lodges at Old Hall, the Prothero residence. And the call Mrs. Price Ridley received came from Mr. Redding's cottage. So this is Inspector Slack's theory. He thinks the killer was trying to frame Redding, but whoever the killer was didn't realize that Redding was no longer going up to Old Hall because Colonel Prothero told him he wasn't allowed to paint Lettice anymore. That's the hole in the killer's plan, because how could Redding have made a call from one of the lodges at Old Hall? He wasn't going up there anymore. The vicar wants to find out if anyone overheard what Colonel Prothero and Mrs. Lestrange were talking about the night she came to visit him. And one of the kitchen maids did overhear some of their conversation, and let me tell you, it sounds suspicious. So I'm going to read to you some direct quotes from pages 176 and 177. So, the master, he was evidently very angry. Quote, after all these years, that's what he was saying. Quote, you dare to come here. It's an outrage. After a bit, he said, quote, I utterly refuse, utterly, etc., etc. She wanted him to do something and he was refusing. He said, quote, it's a disgrace that you should have come down here, and you shall not see her. I forbid it. Now, the characters assume that when he said, you shall not see her, he meant Mrs. Prothero, Anne Prothero. However, if my theory about Mrs. Lestrange being Colonel Prothero's first wife is correct, perhaps the her was not Anne, but Lettice Prothero, because Lettice Prothero would, in this instance, be Mrs. Lestrange's daughter, so perhaps the Colonel was telling her she couldn't go see Lettice. The kitchen maid also claims that Colonel Prothero said, once or twice, quote, "I don't believe it. Whatever Haydock says, I don't believe it." And he also said, quote, "It's all a plot." This fits into my theory so perfectly, but I'm starting to have second thoughts because I'm like, what if it's too easy? They're making Mrs. Lestrange look a bit suspicious now. Is this a misdirection? Maybe she is the first Mrs. Prothero, but she's not the killer. I really don't know. I'm now so confused. I think my theory makes perfect sense, but it just makes so much sense that I'm wondering if I'm wrong. Do you get what I'm saying? I'm just wondering if it's too easy. So we find out that Anne Prothero heard what sounded like someone in the house in the middle of the night. And she finds that there is a portrait that they had stored up in the attic where the face of the portrait has been entirely destroyed. And when she's asked, what was this portrait? She says, "I don't know. I think my husband had this before he married me." Which, if Mrs. Lestrange really is who I think she is, perhaps this was a portrait of her from when she was married to Colonel Prothero, and it had to be destroyed so people wouldn't realize her true identity. Another thing is that Dr. Haydock admits that he used to know Colonel Prothero 20 years ago when they both lived in Westmoreland, which, if Mrs. Lestrange is the first Mrs. Prothero, it could explain how the two of them know each other. He also tells the vicar that the brown crystal he found in the woods looks like something called picric acid, and this is both an explosive and it can also be used to treat burns. Is this relevant? How does this fit in? I don't know, but it happened, so I'm telling you about it. And another thing, remember how the day after the murder, Lettice Prothero showed up at the vicarage claiming she lost her yellow beret in the study. And Miss Marple hinted that she wasn't really coming to look for her hat. She had an ulterior motive. Well, the vicar finds a lapis lazuli earring inside his study, and the vicar recognizes this earring as belonging to Anne Prothero. However, it could not have been left there the night of the murder because Vicar saw them lying out on her dressing table. So it turns out that Lettice went back to the house so she could plant one of the earrings to make Anne look guilty because she hates her stepmother. I only have about 30 or 40 pages left of the book, so I'm going to try to finish it after work today, if possible. I want to say one more thing. So on page 93, Miss Marple is asked, what does Colonel Prothero's death remind you of? And she says multiple things. One, it reminds her of a man who had a secret second family. It also reminds her of Miss Hartnell's opal pin, which went missing from the laundry, and it turns out that one woman hid it in another woman's house out of spite to frame her. And it also reminds her of a girl who tried to stifle her little brother, and the money for the choir boy's outing, which was taken by the organist because his wife was in debt. So what does all of that mean? Well, having two families makes me think of Colonel Prothero, his first and his second wife, which works with my theory. Spite, maybe Mrs. Lestrange is trying to frame Anne and Lawrence Redding out of spite. And the money thing, maybe Mrs. Lestrange and Dr. Haydock need money, and so they're hoping that by framing Anne and Lawrence, then Colonel Prothero's will sort of be voided and they will be able to get some of the money, or it'll all be able to go to Lettice. And since Lettice is Mrs. Lestrange's daughter, if I'm correct, then she thinks she can get the money through Lettice. But then there's also the part about the daughter murdering the brother? Is like Lettice a secret sociopath? I don't really understand that. That's the one thing I don't understand, how Miss Marple sees a connection there. I don't know, but that's where I'm at. I will read up until the point where the murder is about ready to be revealed, update you on everything that happens, and then I will react to the reveal on camera. I might be at the part where we're gonna find out who the killer is because Miss Marple just said who she thinks it is. And if that's actually who the killer is, I'm gonna be pissed. So, in the couple chapters that I just read, we got an official confirmation that the letter was not written by Prothero at all, and there was also an incident involving Mr. Hawes, the curate, where he calls up the vicar, and when the vicar comes over, Hawes is passed out from an overdose, and there's a crumpled letter on the floor confessing to the crime. So it looks like Hawes is guilty, but of course, it's not gonna be that simple. So I'm gonna read to see what Miss Marple has to say, and if this is actually who the murderer is, I'm gonna be a little annoyed. I'm just, honestly, yeah. I'm pissed. Okay, I'm gonna tell you, I'm pissed. So, according to Miss Marple, the killers, there's two people who are in this, are actually Lawrence Redding and Anne Prothero. Yes, the ones who both confessed to the crime earlier and were seemingly cleared. Why did they confess, you may ask? Because they knew that if they confessed at that point in time, they would be found innocent and suspicion would drift away from them. But it was them. So, Anne Prothero actually stopped and talked to Miss Marple so much for that evening, making sure to not bring a handbag so that it would seemingly exclude her from having the gun, when actually the gun was waiting for her in the study, and her husband didn't hear her come up, because it was mentioned several times in the book that he was, like, partially deaf. I never brought it up because I didn't think it was important. And so she then snuck in, shot him, and no one heard the gunshot because there was a silencer. So the gunshot in the woods that everybody thought they heard was actually not a gunshot at all. It was actually the acid exploding in order to sound like a gunshot. Hawes's confession was not actually to the murder, it was to misappropriating the church funds, like Mrs. Price Ridley talked about. Speaking of Mrs. Price Ridley, the call that she received threatening her actually had nothing to do with the murders. People just assumed, since it took place around the same time, that it must be related. But no, the call was actually from Griselda and Dennis, because Mrs. Price Ridley had been accusing the vicar of stealing the church funds, and so they wanted to put an end to that, since that's their husband and uncle, and they don't want people talking badly about him. I'm so mad. I'm so mad. I'm not gonna spoil any other Agatha Christie books here in case you haven't read them yet. However, this ending is so similar to another Agatha Christie that I read that it kind of pisses me off, because I thought to myself, surely she's not gonna go that way again. But she did. There is another book of hers that shall remain nameless where someone is suspected early on and seemingly cleared, and then later it comes out that that person and their accomplice intentionally wanted him to be suspected early on, knowing he would be cleared. And she did the same thing again. Agatha. Why? Okay, well, I was right about one thing. So, Mrs. Lestrange is, in fact, Lettice's mother and Colonel Prothero's first wife. She was in leagues with Dr. Haydock. However, she had merely, I say merely like it's not a big deal. It is a big deal. She found out that she is dying, and so, knowing she didn't have long to live, she wanted to reconnect with Lettice. She wanted to go to Colonel Prothero first out of, respect for him, to do the right thing. He turned her down, so she was able to secretly communicate with Lettice. Lettice is the one who slashed the portrait because she was worried people might suspect her mother of the murder if they knew who she really was. And now the two of them are going to go abroad together to live out the rest of Mrs. Lestrange's life. So I got something right. I am kind of annoyed that the reveal in this book was so similar to like another one. Because I really didn't think she would do that again. Agatha. But it does explain the acid and the woods, which I wasn't really sure what to make of that. So that at least, you know, made sense in the end. Though I don't know like how I was supposed to know there was a silencer. I feel like there were no hints dropped to that, so it kind of feels like a little bit like a cop-out. So I didn't get it right, but man, this video was so much fun. I need to wrap this up because I know I've been going on for way too long. Let me know if you would like to see me try to solve another Agatha Christie book in the future. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more from me. I post new videos every single Wednesday and Sunday. My social media links are down below if you want to follow me on Tumblr, Instagram, or be my friend on Goodreads. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have an awesome rest of your day. Bye, and I'll see you next time.